There's a sound a man makes when three of them hold him down and the fourth one goes to work. And it isn't a scream. It's smaller than that. It's the sound of a grown man trying not to let anyone hear him break. That sound came out of the little diner on Route 9 at 6:40 in the morning, and 11 people heard it, and not one of them stood up. What happened was this. A boy of about 19 who bussed tables and had a stutter he was ashamed of got backed into the corner by the coffee station, and one of the three men who'd walked in wearing new leather and old cruelty took the boy's face in his hand and squeezed it the way you'd test a piece of fruit you had no intention of buying, and told him to smile, told him to smile wider, because the men wanted to see how a stutter smiled. And in the last booth by the window, an old man in a gray work shirt with Vance stitched over the pocket set down his coffee. He was 66 years old that spring, with hair gone the color of ash, and hands that had spent 34 years turning wrenches and hadn't hit a man in longer than that. Everyone in that town knew him. Everyone in that town laughed at his road name, because his road name was Lullaby. And there is no softer word in the English language to pin on a man who fixes motorcycles for a living and pours coffee for a boy who can't afford it. What those three did not know, what nobody laughing had ever bothered to learn, was where a name like that comes from and what a man has to do to earn it. A long time ago, in rooms these boys had never been allowed into, there were men with patches worth killing for, who lowered their voices when Lullaby came up, who changed the subject, who found somewhere else to look. Nobody in that diner that morning had the first idea what was about to happen, least of all the young man with the fresh ink and the borrowed courage who had just decided that squeezing a stuttering boy's face was a good way to start his day. And I'll tell you now that 11 days after that morning, 41 motorcycles would come down Route 9 in a line you could hear from the county road. And I'll tell you why before we're done. But not yet. Because you need to understand who Lullaby used to be before you watch what he does to the rest of them. This is that story. It started barely 20 minutes earlier than that. The diner opened at 6, the way it had opened at 6 for as long as anybody could remember. And the old man was always the first customer through the door. Always the same booth, always the same order he never actually had to give, because Dolores had it in the window before he sat down. 2 eggs, wheat toast, coffee, black. He'd been coming in every single morning for a long time, and he tipped on a $12 breakfast like it was a wedding, and he never once raised his voice at anybody. And the town had decided that was all he was, a gentle old man who fixed bikes. They'd decided it so completely that they'd stopped seeing him at all. That's the thing about a man who's quiet on purpose. People mistake the quiet for the whole story. The boy at the coffee station was named Cody. He was 19. And he'd shown up in town 8 months before with a garbage bag of clothes and a flinch that told you everything about where he'd come from, and nothing you'd want to know. Dolores gave him a job bussing and a room over the garage. The old man gave him something else. The old man gave him a wave every morning, and after a while, a nod, and after a longer while, a seat at the counter on Sundays when the shop was closed and nobody was in a hurry. And he taught the boy how to gap a spark plug and how to look a man in the eye without asking permission first. He never once made the boy talk fast. He'd wait out a stutter the way you wait out weather. The boy would have walked into fire for him and didn't know it yet. Now, the three who came in that morning belonged to something new in the county. They called themselves the Iron Saints, and they wore a patch they'd designed themselves and had made at a shop 2 towns over. And there was not a man among them over 26. They'd rolled into the valley about 4 months back, the way a certain kind of weather rolls in. And they'd worked out fast that a small town with an old sheriff and no money to speak of was a soft place to plant a flag. So they planted one. $200 a week, that was the number. $200 a week from every shop on the strip, and in exchange, the Iron Saints promised that nothing bad would happen to you. Which was a fine promise, coming from the only thing bad that had happened to that town in 20 years. Nobody fought it. Fighting it got your windows broken, or worse. The hardware store fought it for exactly 9 days, and then somebody poured sugar in the owner's truck and put a brick through the front glass, and the hardware store paid $200 a week after that, like everybody else. The old man's shop had not paid. Not because he'd made a speech about it. He didn't make speeches. When the collector had come by Vance Cycle 3 weeks earlier, the old man had listened to the whole pitch, the whole $200 a week and nothing bad happens. And then he'd wiped his hands on a rag and said one word. No. Just that. And something in how he said it, flat and unhurried, and without the smallest tremor in it, had made the collector decide there were easier doors to knock on. And he'd left. And he'd told the others the old man was senile and not worth the trouble. And that it held for 3 weeks. It was not going to hold any more. So that morning, the 3 of them came into the diner to make a point. And the point was not about the old man at all, not at first. The point was that the strip belonged to the Iron Saints. And a boy with a stutter who worked for tips was the easiest way in the world to remind everybody of it. Pure noise, pure mess, the kind of thing that isn't about damage. It's about making sure everyone in the room understands who's in charge for the next few minutes. One of them swept a tray of clean cups off the counter just to hear them break. One of them told Dolores to shut her mouth before she'd opened it. And the big one, the one with the new ink crawling up his neck, took Cody's face in his hand and told him to smile. The old man set down his coffee. He set it down the way he did everything, careful, like it had a right to not be spilled. And he came around the end of that booth and up the aisle, slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world and no particular place he needed to be. The big one saw him coming in the mirror behind the counter and laughed. He let go of the boy and turned around, all 6'3" of him. And he looked at this gray old man in a work shirt, and he laughed. And he asked him what he thought he was going to do. He stopped laughing about 11 seconds later. But we're going to leave him there for a moment, mid-laugh, because that's the part everybody wants to skip straight to. And I'm not going to let you. Not yet. You need to understand exactly who that old man used to be before you watch what he does to the 3 of them. Or it won't mean anything. It'll just be violence. And this was never a story about violence. This was a story about a name. Big he was, in a way that had nothing to do with size. He wasn't a large man. 66 years old, maybe 5'10" with his boots on. Lean, the way old men who work with their hands stay lean. You'd pass him on the street and see nothing. That was the point of him now. And it had taken him decades to build. But there was a time, and men who were there still don't like to talk about it, when Lullaby was the last quiet thing a whole lot of hard men ever heard. The name didn't come from softness. That was the joke of it. The joke the whole town got backwards. In the world he came out of, you didn't get a road name that gentle by being gentle. You got it because of what you did in the dark, and how quiet you did it, and how nobody the job was done on ever made a sound afterward. A lullaby is the last thing you hear before you go to sleep. That's all it ever meant. That's all it had ever meant. The town heard a nursery rhyme. The men who'd earned the right to be afraid heard something else entirely. He'd ridden with a real club once, a long time ago and a long way from here, back when the patch on a man's back was a thing you bled for and sometimes buried men over. He'd come up in it, young and hard, and he'd been good at a thing that a certain kind of life demands and most men can't stomach. And he'd been good at it precisely because he never enjoyed it, never bragged on it, never let it show on his face. Quiet, mostly. But when Lullaby spoke, men who'd killed leaned in without meaning to. He'd worn a patch you don't say out loud in a diner, and he'd carried a reputation the way other men carry a scar. And then one day, he'd set it all down and walked away from it. And the reason he walked away is a whole part of this story I'll come to. For now, you only need to know that when he opened Vance Cycle 34 years ago in a town where nobody knew him, he did it on purpose, the way a man chooses a monastery. He wanted the quiet. He'd earned the quiet. He'd bled other people so he could have it. And he was not going to let 3 boys in matching jackets take it back from him over $200 a week. The antagonist, the one who ran the Iron Saints. His name was Dallas, and he was 24 years old, and he had one long scar through his left eyebrow that he told people came from a knife fight, and had actually come from his father's belt buckle when he was 11. That's the part that matters about Dallas, so hold on to it. His father had been a big man in a small trailer who'd taken every humiliation the world handed him at the plant and the bar and the bank, and had carried all of it home and set it down on his son, over and over, for years, and had never once in his life stood up to a single one of the men who'd actually done it to him. Dallas had watched his father eat humiliation like a daily bread and never answer it, not once. And Dallas had made himself a promise as a boy that whatever else he became, he would never be the man who took it. He'd be the man who gave it. And he'd built the Iron Saints out of that promise, out of exactly that. Because fear was faster than respect, and it looked the same from a distance if you never got too close. He had a smile he used a lot, and had never once made it as far as his eyes. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for him. A wound explains a man. It doesn't excuse him. But you should understand that Dallas was not a monster. He was a frightened boy who had found a way to make everyone else be the frightened one instead. And it had worked so well for so long that he'd forgotten it was a trick. And he'd forgotten that somewhere out in the world, there are men on whom the trick does not work at all. He had never met one. He was about to. Now Dallas did not go to the diner that morning. That matters too. Dallas never went to the ugly parts himself. He sent the 3, and the 3 were good at what they did, which was frightening people who could not fight back. And they had frightened this whole valley for 4 months, and had come to believe that everyone was a person who could not fight back, because everyone they'd ever tried it on had turned out to be. So, when the big one turned around in that diner and saw a gray old man in a work shirt walking up the aisle toward him, slow and unhurried, he saw exactly what Dallas had trained him to see. He saw $200. He saw an easy morning. He saw a man to be laughed at. What he should have seen was a man who had set a very heavy thing down a very long time ago, and who was about to pick it up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then set it down again for good. But before I take you back into that diner, I have to take you somewhere else first, because there's a wall in the back office of Vance Cycle, and on that wall there's a photograph, and you can't understand the man without it. It's an old picture, gone yellow at the edges, and it shows 2 people in front of a motorcycle on a road that runs out into open country. One of them is a young man you would not recognize as the old man in the diner, dark-haired and hard-eyed, and standing like the world owed him something and he'd come to collect. The other is a woman. Her name was Ruth, and everybody who knew her called her Birdie, and nobody now living remembers why. which is exactly the kind of thing that dies when the people who loved a person die. Birdie was the reason Lullaby set the whole thing down. He'd met her when he was still in the life, still deep in it, and she had known exactly what he was and had not flinched. And that was the first time in his life a person had looked at the whole of him and stayed. She didn't ask him to change. That's the thing people always get wrong about it. She never once asked him to be different. She just made him want to be a man who deserved her. And that turned out to be a stronger thing than any promise. They'd left the club together. It cost him. Leaving that world is not a thing you do with a handshake, and there'd been a night, one night, that he never described to anyone, ever. A night that ended with him making a choice to walk away instead of finish something, to take her and go instead of staying to win. He'd chosen her over the last drop of the man he'd been, and he'd stood in front of a mirror in a cheap motel room with her asleep behind him, and made himself a promise, one word at a time so it would hold. Never again. Unless. And then the condition, the only condition, the single crack he left in the door. Unless somebody smaller than him needed the man he used to be. And there was nobody else. That was the deal he made with the mirror, and he'd kept it for over 30 years. Birdie had died 4 years back. Cancer, slow and unfair. And he'd sat with her through every hour of it. And the last promise he'd made her, he made out loud in a hospital room with the machines ticking. And he'd kept that one too, which was that he wouldn't go back to being that man just because she was gone and there was nothing left to lose. He'd promised her the shop would stay open at 6. He'd promised her the quiet. In the shop there's a workbench, and above it there's a set of hooks with a woman's riding gloves hung on them, small ones, and painted on the pegboard behind them is the outline of those gloves in white paint, so that they always go back exactly where they belong, and nothing is ever misplaced. Nobody's touched them in 4 years. He talks to her sometimes, late, when the bay doors are down and the last customer's gone. Not a lot. Just enough. There's one more thing in that back office, and it's not on the wall. It's under the workbench, in a steel box he's checked every single morning for 19 years and never once opened, never once needed. What's in the box is the answer to why 41 motorcycles are going to come down Route 9. But we're not there yet, so leave the box alone for now. He does. Every morning, he crouches down, and he puts 2 fingers on the lid, and he checks that it's there. And he stands back up and goes and opens the shop. It sits under that bench year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. And now we go back to the diner, to the big man mid-laugh, because it's time. The old man gave him a chance first. He always did, right to the end of his life. And it wasn't weakness. It was the last piece of the promise. He stood there half a second longer than he needed to, and he said one thing, quiet. So quiet the big man had to stop laughing just to hear it. Let the boy go home. That was all. Not a threat. An off-ramp. A door left open. The big man could have walked through it. Most of the men who ever got that door from Lullaby had not walked through it, because they couldn't hear what it was, and the big one couldn't hear it either. He reached out to take the old man's face the way he'd taken Cody's. He never got there. What happened next happened in 11 seconds, maybe 12, and I'm going to give it to you the way it happened, one thing at a time, because that's the only honest way to tell it. The old man moved inside the reaching arm instead of away from it, which no one that big ever expects, because everyone runs from a man that big, and nobody walks into him. He took the wrist that was coming for his face, and he turned it, just turned it, 1/4 turn. And the big man went to his knees on the broken cups, because the alternative was a snapped arm, and the body decides that faster than the mind does. The second one came off the counter stool, swinging, and the old man stepped off the line of it, let it go by, and put an elbow into the hinge of the man's jaw on the way past. One clean touch. And the second one sat down on the floor and stayed there. Not out, just done. The way a man sits down when the room stops making sense. The third one, the smart one, went for the door. The old man let him. Always let the ones go who want to go. That's geometry, not mercy, though it's a little of both. 11 seconds. 2 on the floor, 1 out the door, and the old man already turning away from all of it, because they'd stopped being the point the moment they stopped moving. He crouched down in front of Cody, who was pressed into the corner with both hands over his own mouth. And he didn't say, "Are you all right?" because the boy wasn't, and they both knew it. He just put a hand on the back of the boy's neck, steady, the way you'd gentle a spooked animal, and he waited. He waited out the shaking the way he waited out the stutter, the way he waited out weather. And then he stood up, and he took a rag out of his back pocket, and he swept up the broken cups himself, all of them, on his knees on that floor, while 11 people who had watched a boy get hurt and had not moved, now watched an old man clean up after them, and still could not seem to move. He put a 20 on the counter for the cups. He always overpaid. He looked at the big man, who was cradling his wrist and breathing through his teeth, and he said the second and last thing he said in that diner. "Tell whoever sent you, the shop's still not paying. And tell him, the boy's off limits." And then he walked out into the morning and got on the old man's own motorcycle, the one Bertie was standing next to in the photograph. And he rode the 400 yards to Vance's cycle and opened the bay doors at 7 like he had every day for 34 years. And he believed, he honestly believed, that the matter was finished. He was wrong. The worst of it hadn't introduced itself yet. Here's what happened in the 20 minutes after the 2 Iron Saints limped out of that diner. They didn't go to Dallas. They were too scared to go to Dallas, because going to Dallas meant explaining how one gray old man had put 2 of them down in front of a full diner. And that story didn't have a version that made them look like anything but what they were. So they went to the clubhouse, which was a rented pole barn on the edge of the valley, and they told the story small, and they told it wrong, and they said the old man got lucky, and they said it loud enough that the man they least wanted to hear it heard it anyway. Because there was an older man in the Iron Saints. Just one. His name was Boone, and he was 59, over 30 years older than anyone else in that pole barn, and nobody was ever quite sure how he'd ended up riding with a bunch of kids. And the answer was that Boone had ridden with everybody once, in the real world, in the old world, and had washed up here at the end of a long, hard life because it was the last patch that would have him. Boone had a past he didn't advertise, and Boone heard 2 boys describe a gray old man in a work shirt in a diner on Route 9, and something in the back of his neck went cold. He asked them a question. He didn't ask about the fight. He asked what the man's name was. They didn't know his real name. They knew what the town called him. And one of them, rubbing his jaw, said it like it was the funniest part of the whole thing. Said the old man's road name. Said they call him Lullaby. And laughed. And Boone, who had gone the color of old paper, sat down slowly on a folding chair. and took off his cut, his own club vest, and turned it over in his hands. And he did not laugh. The boys watched him do it and stopped laughing themselves, because there was nothing in the world more frightening to a young, hard man than watching an old, hard man get scared. Boone turned that vest over and over in his hands, and he said, quiet, that he needed them to tell him exactly what the old man looked like. Gray hair, work shirt, name over the pocket, one of them remembered. Vance. And Boone closed his eyes. And then Boone told them a story. And it's the story none of them had ever heard, because they were children, and it belongs to a world that had ended before they were born. He told them that 30 years ago and more, in the real life, there was a name that men used to say the way you'd say the word for a disease. Lullaby. He told them the name wasn't a joke, and had never been a joke, and that he'd only ever seen the man once from across a room at a sit-down between two clubs that could have gone very bad, and that Lullaby had been sent by the other side, alone, as a message, and the message was received. He told them the man had never raised his voice that whole night, and that everyone in that room, men who feared nothing, had watched where he put his hands. He told them Lullaby had gotten his name because he was the last quiet thing certain men ever heard, and that he'd walked away from all of it decades ago over a woman, and that everybody in the life had let him go, which was the most frightening part of all, because the life does not let people go. And if it had let Lullaby go, it was because even they didn't want to be the ones to try and stop him. And then one of the boys asked the question the young always ask, the stupid, brave question. Whether Lullaby had anybody left, whether it was just one old man now, whether the whole thing was just some over-the-hill legend rusting away in a bike shop. And Boone looked at him. And this is the part that changed the temperature of the whole room. Boone said he didn't know. He said that was the thing about a man like that. You never knew who'd come if you touched him. You never knew what he'd banked over 40 years, or who owed him what. And not knowing, Boone said, was worse than a yes. Because a yes you could plan for. Not knowing meant you could pour everything you had into a shop on Route 9 and find out at the very end that you'd been the smallest problem the man had. That should have been where it stopped. Boone told them, plain as he could, to give the old man his valley back and forget the $200 a week from Vance's cycle, and thank God the man had let two of them walk out of that diner breathing. And that would have been the smart thing, and if Dallas had heard it from anyone but Boone, he might even have done it. But Dallas came into the pole barn at the end of it, and heard the tale of the story, and heard his own men sitting quiet and scared around an old man, and something in him that was 11 years old and watching his father eat humiliation stood up. Because here was the thing Dallas could not survive. If a gray old man could put two iron saints on a diner floor and the iron saints did nothing, then the fear was gone. And if the fear was gone, the whole thing was gone. Because there had never been anything underneath it but fear. It had never been respect. Boone had told him to his face once that he was building on fear because it was faster, and Dallas had smiled that smile and said, fast was good enough. So it stopped being a shakedown. It became something else. It stopped being about $200 a week and became about whether Dallas got to keep being the man who gave humiliation, instead of the man who took it. And that is the most dangerous kind of enemy there is. Not the one who wants your money, but the one who needs you gone to keep being who he told himself he was. Dallas didn't decide to collect from Vance's cycle. Dallas decided to erase it.
He got on the phone that afternoon, and he called in every man who wore the patch and some who wanted to, and he told them there'd be a thing done on Route 9 in 11 days. And he counted them as they said yes. And by nightfall, he had it in his head that 41 men on their bikes would roll up on one old man in a bike shop. And that would be the end of the question, once and for all. Boone did not say yes. Boone sat in the corner and turned his vest over in his hands and understood, better than anyone in that room, that Dallas had just walked the whole club up to a door that could not be unopened. And out advanced Cycle, the old man was closing the bay for the night, unaware of most of it and guessing the rest. And he crouched down under the workbench, and he put 2 fingers on the lid of the steel box the way he had for 19 years. And this time, he didn't stand right back up. This time he stayed down there a while. Word travels in a small valley faster than any motorcycle. Within days, half the strip knew that something was coming for the old man. And the way they knew was that the Iron Saints had gone quiet. And the Iron Saints going quiet was worse than the Iron Saints breaking your windows. The hardware store owner came by the shop and stood in the bay and couldn't get the words out, and finally just said he was sorry, which is a thing men say when they mean they're afraid and can't help you. The old man thanked him and went back to the carburetor he was cleaning. Dolores came by from the diner with a foil plate of food he hadn't asked for, because that's what she did. She fed people she was scared for. And she stood in the doorway with the plate and said, "Earl, you should go somewhere for a few days." And it was the first time in the whole story anyone had said his real name, Earl. And he took the plate with both hands and said, "Thank you, Dolores," and did not go anywhere. Cody wouldn't leave. That was the hard part. The old man tried to send the boy away first, before anything else, tried to hand him a fold of cash and the keys to a truck and tell him to go visit somebody, anybody, for a week.
And the boy, who could barely get a sentence out on a good day, looked at the old man and got the whole thing out clean. Not a single stutter in it. He said, "You didn't leave me in that corner." And that was that. The old man looked at the boy for a long moment, and something moved in his face that hadn't moved in 4 years, and he put the cash back in his pocket. He didn't want the boy there, not out of fear for himself. He didn't want the boy to have to watch him become, for a few minutes, the man he'd spent 30 years burying, the man Bertie had loved enough to pull out of the dark. He didn't want those to be the eyes that saw Lullaby come back. But the boy wouldn't go, and there wasn't time to make him, because the sound had started on the county road. You could hear them before you could see them. That's a thing about a lot of motorcycles arriving with no intention of leaving anyone behind who could talk about it later. It doesn't sound like traffic. It sounds like weather coming, like a storm that decided to use engines. The old man heard it from inside the shop, and he did 3 things, calm, in order. He sent Cody into the back office and told him to put the steel box on the workbench and not to open it, and to stay behind the glass of the office window where the boy could see and not be seen. He rolled the big bay door most of the way down so they could only come at him through the man door, one at a time, which is geometry, which is the whole thing, which is why an old man can survive what's coming, and a young one can't. And then he crouched one last time under the bench, and this time he opened the box. 66 years old, about to be outnumbered by a margin that would have made most men twice his size lie down and pray, and still, by a wide distance, the most dangerous thing within 500 yards of that shop. He didn't panic. He counted. He counted the man door and the back exit and the window and the tool wall and the angles between them.
and he did it with the flat, professional calm of a man doing arithmetic he'd done 10,000 times in another life, and had hoped to never do again. People who know exactly what they're walking into and secure the room anyway are a different breed of dangerous entirely. Out on the road, the storm turned in at the lot, and the engines died one by one. And then there were boots. A lot of boots. And then there was quiet. The deliberate quiet men make when they want you to hear how many of them there are. Dallas came in last. That's how it works. The dangerous ones go first, and the frightened one who's pretending comes last. And the old man knew that before the door even opened. Knew it the way you know which note comes next in a song you've heard your whole life. They came in careful. That was the first thing the old man noticed, and it told him everything. They didn't come in laughing and loose the way the three in the diner had. They came in the way men come in when somebody has told them a story, when Boone has stood in a pole barn and turned his vest over in his hands, when the word lullaby has done to them what it was always meant to do. They came in afraid, which made them slow, and slow was the only gift the old man needed. Dallas talked. Of course he talked. He came in past his own men, and he stood in the middle of the bay, and he ran his mouth. About respect, about the valley, about how this was just business, and it didn't have to be this way, and the old man had brought it on himself. And he talked because talking was the last of the trick, the fear machine running on fumes. And the old man didn't answer a word of it. Because the words weren't the threat. The words were noise. So he didn't answer the words. He answered the spread. He watched how the men were moving to fill the room, watched the two on the flanks trying to get behind him, and he understood which of them actually knew what they were doing, and which were just meat. And there was exactly one in that room who was a real problem. A wide, quiet one by the door, who hadn't said anything, and hadn't stopped watching the old man's hands. And the old man went for him first. The first fight in the diner had been fast. This one wasn't fast. This one was a war. He put his back to the steel workbench so they could only come at him from the front, and he made every single one of them pay full price for stepping into that room. The quiet, wide one came, and the old man met him low and folded him, and used the falling weight of him as a wall against the next two. A pipe came down, and the old man wasn't where it came down. A knife came in, and the old man turned the wrist the way he'd turned the wrist in the diner, 1/4 turn, and the knife went across the floor under a shelf where nobody was going to get it back. Each strike got its own moment. He didn't waste one. He didn't throw a single thing he didn't need. But there were so many of them, and the bench at his back could only do so much, and his body began joint by joint to send up the bill. His body reminded him, one knee, then one shoulder, then the deep old ache in his ribs, that he wasn't the man he'd been at 30. 4 decades had taken a great deal from him. His hands were slower. His wind was shorter. He took a boot to the side that would have broken a younger, softer man, and it folded something in him that didn't fully unfold again. But 4 decades hadn't taken the one thing that had always mattered most about him, the thing that had earned the name in the first place. In a fight, Lullaby simply did not stop. It wasn't strength, and it had never been strength. It was that some men, when the fight goes long and the body starts to quit with it, and a very few do not. And he was one of the ones who did not, and everyone who'd ever bet against that had lost. Then it happened, the thing that happens, the moment the whole story bends around. One of them got a bar across the back of the old man's head, a real blow, a fight-ending blow. and for one long, terrible second, the whole shop tilted sideways in front of his eyes, and the floor came up an inch, and the sound went far away. Behind the office glass, Cody watched the old man's knees start to go, and the boy's hand came up over his own mouth, and the boy stopped breathing. Every man left standing in that bay believed in that second that they were about to watch the old man go down for good. So did the old man. He didn't go down. He got a hand on the bench, Bertie's bench, right underneath where her small gloves hung in their white painted outline, and he pulled himself back up out of it on nothing but will, one hand at a time. And he turned back around to face the room. And the men who saw him do that took a step back without deciding to, because it is a terrible thing to watch a man refuse to fall. And that was the moment the thing appeared that changes every fight there is. Dallas, who had been standing back the whole time letting his men spend themselves on the old man, saw that the old man would not go down, saw the fear come back into his own men's faces, saw the trick failing in real time in front of everyone. And Dallas pulled a gun. A gun changes a fight. It doesn't matter how skilled a man is, how tough, how willing, how much will he's got left in a body that's already broken. A gun voids all of it. And the room went silent. Total silence. The only sound in that whole shop was the tick of a cooling engine out in the lot, and under it, the smaller sound of the old man breathing hard through a split lip. Everyone stopped. The men stopped. The old man stopped, one hand still on Bertie's bench. And Dallas stood there in the middle of the ring of his own men with a gun pointed at a 66-year-old man, and his hand was shaking. It was shaking because Dallas, for all of it, for all the 4 months and the broken windows and the $200 a week, had never actually crossed this line, had never once done the ugly part himself, had always sent the three, had always come in last. He'd built a whole world so he would never have to be the one holding the thing. And now he was the one holding the thing. And it was shaking in his hand. And the old man spoke, in the same quiet he'd used on the big man in the diner, the same quiet he'd used across a room at a sit-down 30 years ago, the quiet that made men lean in. He looked at Dallas, past the gun, right at the frightened boy behind it, and he said, "If your hand does that when you pull it, you'll miss. And then it's just you and me. And you've seen what I do up close." He said it flat, not a threat, arithmetic. And you could see it land in Dallas, the whole terrible math of it, that he had one chance to end this clean, and his hand wouldn't hold still enough to take it. And that if he tried and failed, everything he'd built came apart in a room full of witnesses. And that was when the office door opened, and Cody came out. The boy had had a clean way out the whole time, the back exit, 10 feet from where he'd been standing, wide open, nobody watching it. He'd had every reason in the world to run, and no one alive would have blamed him. He came out anyway, and in his hands he held the steel box, the one from under the bench, the one the old man had told him not to open. And it was open now, and the boy held it up over his head with both hands so the whole room could see. And Cody, who couldn't order a sandwich without a stutter, stood in the middle of 40 armed men and said, clear as a bell, no stutter in it anywhere, that he'd taken pictures of every single thing in that box on his phone, and that the phone had already sent them somewhere, and that if one shot got fired in that shop, every man in it was finished, because of what was in the box and who it named. Nobody in that room knew what was in the box, but Boone did. Boone was standing near the back, and Boone looked at that open box in the boy's raised hands, and Boone made a sound like the air going out of a tire. And Boone said one word. He said, "Don't." Not to the boy, to Dallas. Because whatever was in that box, Boone recognized it, the way Boone had recognized the name. And whatever it was the ledger of an entire life in a world these boys had only heard about in a story 2 nights ago. And Boone did not want to be within 100 miles of what happened if it came out. It was a bluff, what the boy said. And it wasn't a bluff, that's the thing. The old man had never told Cody what was in the box, had told him not to open it. And the boy had opened it, and made up the part about the phone on the spot, out of nothing but love and terror. But the box itself was real, and the fear in Boone's face was real, and the not knowing was real. Exactly the not knowing Boone had described in the pole barn. The not knowing that was worse than a yes. And you could watch the math land in real time. Watch it go around the room from man to man, every one of them running the same arithmetic. If the old man was who Boone said he was, and if that box was what Boone's face said it was, then not one of them was walking out of a fired shot as a free man. And not one of them was sure enough to bet his whole life on the boy lying. The gun came down first, slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument Dallas's arm had been losing since he raised it.
And once the gun came down, the room came apart. Not in violence, in retreat. Man after man deciding all at once that whatever $200 a week had ever been worth, it was not worth this. Backing toward the man door, then turning, then going. The old man walked across the shop, slow, unhurried, favoring the folded thing in his ribs, and he took the gun out of Dallas's shaking hand, and Dallas let him. Just opened his fingers and let him take it, the way a child gives up a thing he was never supposed to have. It was over. Truly over this time. No more blows. The last and hardest fight of the old man's life ended with him gently taking a gun out of a frightened boy's hand, while another frightened boy held a steel box over his head. And not one more person was hurt. They left the way people leave a funeral, quiet, careful, nobody looking back. Boone was the last of the Iron Saints to go, and he stopped in the man door, and he looked back at the old man across the wreckage of that shop, and he didn't say anything for a second. And then he said the old road name once more. Not Earl, the one from the old world. Lullaby. And he said it the way you'd say a prayer you were surprised you still remembered. And the old man nodded at him, one old man to another. 2 survivors of a country that didn't exist anymore. And Boone touched the brim of nothing, the way you do, and went. The sheriff got there 20 minutes later, an old man himself, and he found what you find after a thing like that, which is one shop full of wreckage and one man sitting on a stool in the middle of it with a split lip and a bag of frozen peas from the shop refrigerator held to the back of his head. Because there's always a bag of something cold, and a bench full of tools knocked to the floor, and a 19-year-old boy sitting on the concrete next to the stool with his shoulder against the old man's leg, not talking, not needing to. The sheriff looked around at all of it, and then he looked at the old man, and the old man looked back. And the sheriff had known there was something to Earl Vance for 34 years, and had had the good sense to never once ask. He asked now if the old man wanted to make a statement,
The old man said there'd been a disagreement, and it was settled, and nobody needed the sheriff to do anything about it. And the sheriff looked at him a long moment, and then wrote down that there'd been a disagreement, and it was settled. But the town made its own statements. And this is the part that finished the Iron Saints. Because 11 people had watched 3 men hurt a boy in a diner and do nothing. And every one of those 11 people had had to carry that. And now they got a chance to set it down. Within a week, the sheriff's office had 11 sworn statements about the diner, and Dolores had one. And the hardware store owner found his spine and gave one about his windows and his truck. And the pictures the town had taken over 4 months of broken glass and payments and fear all came out at once. And the county prosecutor, who'd been looking for a reason, got 11 reasons and then 40 more. The Iron Saints came apart inside a month. Not in a battle, in a courthouse. Warrants, statements, the pole barn lease revoked, the whole thing folding up under the weight of every small, brave person in that valley, finally telling the truth at the same time. It turned out fear was faster, just like Dallas said. It just didn't last, and respect did. And the town had had respect for that old man the whole time, and only just now understood what it was worth. And one by one the shops on the strip took themselves back. The hardware store put in new glass and didn't pay anybody for the privilege of keeping it. Dolores hung a little hand-painted sign in the diner window that just said, "Open," like it was a dare.
The smallest one was the one that got everybody. Cody, the boy, went down to the county office the week it was all over and legally changed one thing, and it wasn't his name. It was that he registered a motorcycle, his first, a wreck the old man helped him rebuild from the frame up, and on the title, where they asked for nothing in particular, he'd asked the old man what his real road name had been, the true one, and the old man had told him, and the boy hadn't taken it. You don't take a name like that. But he'd earned a small one of his own that summer in that shop, and the old man had given it to him, quiet, over coffee on a Sunday. And it fit, and the boy wore it the rest of his life. Dallas got the most time. He deserved it, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I'll tell you one more thing about him, because the story owes it. About 3 years into it, a letter came to the shop. It was from Dallas, and it was short, and it didn't ask for anything, didn't ask to be forgiven, didn't ask for a visit, didn't try to make itself smaller than it was. It just said that he'd spent his whole life swearing he'd never be the man his father was, the one who took it and never answered, and that he'd become something worse instead, and that the old man in the shop was the first man he'd ever met who was actually strong, actually all the way down, and who had chosen not to use it on people who couldn't stop him, and that Dallas was trying, in there, to learn how to be that instead. He didn't ask for a reply. The old man read it twice, and then he put it in the box under the bench, the steel one, which by then held one more thing than it used to, and he closed the lid. And Boone, the old one, the one who'd recognized the name, he never rode with anybody again. He testified. He didn't have to, and it cost him whatever safety a man like that has left. And he did it anyway. And afterward he came by the shop once, and the 2 old men sat in the bay and drank coffee, and did not talk much about the old world. And when Boone left, the old man walked him to his bike. And that was the last either of them saw of the other. And neither one needed it to be more than it was. The years went the way years go. Cody stayed. He ran the front, then more than the front, and he opened the shop at 6 every morning because that was simply how the place ran now.
and it never once occurred to him to change it. The old man got older, the way even the hardest of them do if they're lucky enough. And one winter he got slower, and one spring he didn't come out to the bay much. And one morning in his 16th year of the boy knowing him, he didn't wake up, quiet in his own bed, the way almost none of the men he'd come up with had gotten to go. And the town buried Earl Vance, and half the county came, and nobody there said the word lullaby out loud. Because by then everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who he'd been, and exactly who he'd chosen to become instead. They kept his booth in the diner empty. Dolores wouldn't seat anybody in it, not ever again. And after Dolores was gone, the next people kept it empty too, because that was the rule even after nobody remembered why. The same way nobody remembered why they called Ruth Vance Birdie. And in the shop, on the wall, the photograph stayed. And above the bench, the small gloves stayed in their white painted outline. And under the bench, the steel box stayed. And Cody checked it every morning with 2 fingers on the lid, the way he'd seen the old man do, and never once opened it, and never once needed to. It sat there, year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Now think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A diner on Route 9, 6:40 in the morning. An old man in a work shirt, gray hair, hands that hadn't hit anyone in 30 years, and a room full of people laughing at his road name. It looked, in that very first moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. It looked like the strong taking from the weak, like the world doing the thing the world too often does. 3 hard young men and 1 soft old one, and a boy in the corner who couldn't even ask for help. That's what it looked like. But that's the thing about quiet men. The quiet isn't weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice, made on purpose by somebody who has already been everywhere violence can take a person, and has stood in the ashes of it, and has decided, all the way down, to come back from it, and stay back. Those 3 saw an old man to be laughed at. What they should have seen was a man who had set a very heavy thing down a long time ago, and who would pick it back up exactly once for exactly the right reason, and set it down again for good. That's what a name like Lullaby really means in the end. Not the softest man in the room, the one who earned the right to be gentle, and chose it every single morning at 6. I'll tell you, the fight was never the part of this worth sitting with. The fight is the least interesting thing that happened on Route 9. What's worth sitting with is the boy who wouldn't leave the corner where the old man had once refused to leave him, and the gloves that never came off the wall, and a whole town of ordinary, scared people who finally, all at once, decided to tell the truth. So let me ask you something, and I mean it. I read every one of these. When Cody came out of that office holding the box over his head, when the boy who could barely speak stood up in a room full of armed men and lied and told the truth in the same breath, what would you have done, standing where he stood, with a clear way out the back door? If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for stories about the quiet ones, the men and women the world underestimates right up until the moment it can't anymore, and the debts of kindness that get paid back years later when nobody's expecting it. If that's your kind of story, stay a while. Ride with us. There's a seat at the counter for you. There are 2 more stories waiting on the screen right now that I think you'll want to hear. And thank you, honestly, for caring enough about a gray old man in a work shirt to stay all the way to the end. That means more than you know.